Welcome back. This is the last Sunday of our series on the book of Ruth. 4 chapters, 4 weeks. It's surprising how much we managed to milk out of these 4 chapters, but there's more to uncover today. But before we start, we'll start with a prayer. This comes from the prayer book. It's a prayer for the diversity of races and cultures, a prayer of thanksgiving. And I offer this because this week we see Ruth's journey from Moab and being a Moabite person to being in Judah and being an Israelite. We see that journey complete, and complete not just for her own sake, but she becomes an ancestor to David and even to Jesus. And so her inclusion in Israel is more than complete, if you will. And it's a celebration of diversity that God says, look, his kingdom is very, very inclusive. It's one way to read all of that. So I thought we'd open with this prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O God, who created all peoples in your image, we thank you for the wonderful diversity of races and cultures in this world. Enrich our lives by ever-widening circles of fellowship. And show us your presence in those who differ most from us, until our knowledge of your love is made perfect in our love for all your children. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Okay, so as I said, this is week 4. We're going to wrap up our time in Ruth. And I want to open, as I often have, with a question. And it's an odd question because you might wonder what I mean by the word rescued. But that's the question. Have you ever been rescued? And what I mean, well, I don't know what I mean by that. I leave that to you to define however you will. Have you ever been rescued?
I was rescued once in Savannah, Georgia. My car flooded out in Forsyth Park, and I had 2 small baby children, and some strange man stopped, picked us up, and took us home, and I've often thought he could have been Jack the Ripper, but he turned out to be a policeman, and it was as nice as he could be.
Wonderful. Wow. You had the right guy at the right time.
I have a similar story. I had a wreck with the children in the car and went off and hit a bridge, and it was pretty bad. And it was snowing. Donna remembers this, I'm sure. And big flakes. And I was in the middle of a creek, and the car was, I don't know, it was just awful. But anyway, the AT&T or repairman drove across the bridge, and he thought he saw skid marks, and he looked out, and Elizabeth had on a little red jacket, and he saw this red jacket, and he stopped, and he got a telephone cord, that they'd string up, and tied it to his truck. He was 6'4" or 6'6", something, great big guy, and walked across the ice, and it fell with him in it, and it went up to his chest. And anyway, he got us all out. And then he got some kind of an award from the AT&T for being a hero. It's a big deal at the time. It was still frightening to think of it.
Yeah,
Elizabeth I couldn't find her. I thought she was under the water. It was terrible.
Oh.
But anyway, it was horrible. But he was a great guy. And I've never, I don't know what happened to him after that. But anyway, they had a dinner at the country club honoring him and everything.
Okay, so Dudley, you and Donna both described sort of more physical rescues. What other ways can we be rescued or saved, or whatever verb you wish to use?
Spiritually.
My story of rescue, when I first think of being rescued, I didn't have a very happy home as a child. And so every summer we went to my grandparents' house, which was like this magical child land. And so every summer I feel like I was rescued.
Precious. I love that.
I won't go into all the details because it's a long story, and some of you probably have heard it before. I'm sure I've worked this into a sermon or two along the way, but when I was a junior in high school, I felt very disconnected. There was something missing in my life. I wasn't getting it at school. I wasn't getting it from family. And it was at that point I made a connection to the youth group at St. John's Cathedral in Albuquerque. And in some very real ways, they rescued me. You know, they saved me from all my teenage angsty nonsense. Well, not nonsense, but all that stuff that teenagers go through. And they became a real point of connection for me with teens, with peers in a way that I'd never been connected. And most fundamentally, of course, they connected me with God. And I'd never had that connection before. So I think there's all sorts of ways in which we can be rescued. This is a Ruth is a story about rescue in no small way. You know, and we've talked about Naomi and journeying with Elimelech to Moab because of the famine in Judah, and they've got their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. The sons get married to Orpah and Ruth, and then Elimelech dies, and Mahlon and Chilion die. We remember all that story, and then once the famine is ended, Naomi and Ruth journey back to Judah. Orpah staying behind, but Ruth clings to Naomi, in part because maybe she's driven in some sense by need, but certainly a great sense in her words of commitment and love and care for Naomi. I mean, she sees Naomi, this woman from Judah, this woman from a different land. I mean, Naomi is her mom. I mean, in all the real ways, she is family in all the most important ways. But they get back to Judah, and of course, they have no means of support. Women in those days without a husband or a brother or a son or a father or some male figure in their lives were unable really to provide for themselves in ways, obviously, that is available in the modern era. So we heard of the short-term solution, Ruth going and gathering among the sheaves, the gleaning, out of the fields. Of course, they needed a long-term solution. And we heard last week how Naomi hatched a plan. Says, look, this Boaz is a good guy. He's related to on Elimelech's side of the family, and so he's kin. And there's an opportunity here, and she puts together a plan for Ruth to go and work her way, if you will, into Boaz's life. And Boaz is very receptive. He knows that Ruth is of good character. She's a hard worker. She's made sacrifices to be with Naomi. And she flatters him because she could have turned her attention to younger men, but she pays attention to Boaz, who then says, well, listen, I will, there's somebody else I need to talk to who's more closely related, who may have a better claim, if you will. But if he chooses not to redeem you, to connect with you, to marry you, to provide for you, I will. So here's where we pick up the story in chapter 4. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin, of whom Boaz had spoken, came passing by. So Boaz said, come over, friend, sit down here. And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. He then said to the next of kin, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me so that I may know, for there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you. So he said, I will redeem it. They're gathering at the gate. The gate, we think of that sort of as a boundary. Gates usually mark the way from the outside to the inside, or the inside to the outside. In this instance, the gate really is the center. This is, where you were coming into the town, yes. But because this is where everybody would come in and go out, that's where much commerce took place. And if you needed anything legal to be witnessed, that's where you took care of that kind of business. So it is at the center of town. So it was very likely he would find the next of kin there. It'd be very easy to find elders and others to bear witness to what was going to take place. Now, it's interesting that Boaz is speaking to the next of kin, but he's never named. He's simply identified as next of kin, friend, or simply he. Remember that the book of Ruth gives people symbolic names, names that have meaning beyond just, hey, somebody has, everybody needs a name. They go beyond that, right? Ruth is companion. Naomi is pleasant, and so forth. So isn't it curious that we've got a character who plays a pretty significant role here who's not given a name? Why not? Why do you think he isn't? What did the writer of Ruth just run out of ideas, or why do you think he's not given a name? Any ideas? Well, here's a thought, and it's not original. I've been reading, of course, but some have suggested he's not given a name because he doesn't deserve a name. As we talked about last week, Elimelech's family, male kin, have an obligation to the widows of the family, specifically in this case to Ruth. Now, unless you're a brother, if you're a brother, you have a specific obligation to care for your brother's widow. If you're not a brother, but you're still family, you have an obligation, but it's not specific. So, there's no compunction here, no absolute necessity or requirement that if you're not a brother, you care for him. But there is still that expectation that family care for family. This guy isn't. And so maybe that's why he's not given a name, because frankly, he's not worthy of a name. Now, Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city. You want witnesses. You want elders who are community leaders. They're going to bear witness. So that if something comes up later and there's some dispute about what was agreed to, you'd be able to find at least a handful of people to say, oh, no, wait. I was there. I heard, I saw, I know. And so that's part of this. In today's parlance, you wouldn't find elders. You'd find a lawyer and you draw up a contract and you'd have it witnessed. This is the equivalent of that. But without having to go to a lawyer and pay all those fees, I guess. Then we come to this whole thing that he does, and he talks about this parcel of land. All right, pop quiz. When was the first time we heard about a parcel of land owned by Elimelech? All right, well, that's a trick question. This is the first time, isn't it? We've never heard about a parcel of land at stake in any of this. Only now do we hear about this, which is kind of curious. And the question here is, well, if Naomi had a claim to a parcel of land, how come she has to be worried about how she's going to care for herself or her family? Part of it is, as a woman, she's not allowed to own property. She wouldn't have been allowed to take advantage of that. I mean, that just seems so unfair and so incomprehensible to modern ears, at least to my ears. But apparently that's the way it was. So this is why she needs somebody like Boaz to step in and manage that. So we think about, why doesn't she just sell the land herself? Well, she really couldn't, but Boaz can. So he makes this offer. He talks about, here's this land, and you've got the best claim. If you want it, take it. If not, I'll take it. And what does the guy said? He says, I'll redeem it. Right? I will redeem it. I will purchase it. I will keep it in the family. But this is a story about Ruth. How come Boaz hasn't talked about Ruth? Isn't that curious? I mean, he went there because of Ruth, and all he's talked about so far is land. Well, let's press on a little bit further in a moment. One thing to remember before we get back to Ruth and what happens next in the story is to ask this. Ruth's initiative, remember her initiative in going to Boaz, in doing even more than Naomi had suggested in their plan together. That initiative only takes her so far. She has to, at this point, she has to trust Boaz. She has to trust Boaz to do whatever is needed so that she can be cared for forever. So that brings me to a next question I want to throw open to everybody. And is there anybody that you trust completely?
Mm-hmm.
I trust Will completely.
Yeah. not to cheat you or something, Eddie, or my children.
Okay, good.
I can't say I trust Darwin completely, but
Well, you
will
will
for
when
sure.
he gets older.
For now, Amanda, that just means you're a good parent because you're paying attention. Yeah, but you do trust Darwin to an extent. I mean, in certain ways, I would imagine,
Yes.
but in other ways, not so much, right? Yeah. Why is it hard to trust people completely?
Motives.
And people are people. They're imperfect.
Yeah. I had somebody come up to me a few years back wanting for me to be named in power of attorney for them. It's like, and they're not family. They're not. I mean, it's just like, oh, to be honest, I didn't welcome that trust because it's a burden. If you think people are really, really trusting you, that can carry with it a pretty heavy obligation, can't it?
Yes.
So anyway, so here, Ruth, I mean, she unfortunately, she can't get where she needs to go by herself. She has to trust in somebody else. And Ruth, who seems to have all sorts of initiative and willingness to go out on her own, do her own thing, at this point, all she can do is wait on Boaz, whom she trusts has the good motives, whom she trusts will have the right plan, whom she trusts will do the right thing. So
she trusts Naomi.
That's true. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a very good point. And we see that sense of trust because, of course, that proclamation she offers very early on to say, "I'm with you," and so that's a good thing. So Boaz is conducting this business. He's not yet mentioned Ruth, but he's about to. Verses 5 and 6. Then Boaz said, this is me, not the Bible. And Boaz said, by the way, the rest is from the Bible. By the way, the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. At this, the next of kin said, I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Isn't that curious? Finally, at least Ruth shows up. Ruth is at least mentioned. Right? We will not hear her speak in any of this chapter, but at least she gets a passing mention. And isn't it interesting? Look what Boaz has done here. If he had gone to the guy and said, look, there's some land that you could acquire because you're kin, and it was only about the land, the guy was willing to say yes. If he had said, there's a beautiful woman here who needs to be cared for, again, this next of kin might have said yes. But Boaz links the two, which isn't really suggested in Israelite law. It's not there in Mosaic law, but maybe it was a part of the custom of the day. But the commentators I read couldn't find that link other than in this story, and certainly not in the law. But by linking the two, he has now made Ruth, if you will, less attractive, right? And the reason is this. As the guy says, I can't redeem it for myself. It would damage my inheritance. And what that's all about is if he takes that bit of land, maybe it's a tiny parcel of land, and adds it to his own holdings, anybody who's going to inherit from him will inherit a share of the total holdings. So if Ruth has a son, right, then that son would perhaps share in an inheritance. If he has other children, other sons that would inherit, now they're having to share with one more person. It might reduce their share. Sort of complicated way of putting it. One of the books I've been reading puts it this way. The nearer kinsman may have feared that if Ruth bore him a son, that son would eventually inherit not only the redeemed property, but in all likelihood part of his own estate as well. So here he's worried about if he brings Ruth in and she has a son, his other kids may get less. And so he's looking at this from a very commercial, very economic perspective of, okay, what's going to happen to my sons? So all of this sounds very businesslike, doesn't it? And it's going to get even more so. Verses 7 to 10. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, he took off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. This is very much the conclusion of a contract. Right? But again, it's not being written up in legalese and put down on paper and signed and notarized and all that. It's happening in front of witnesses. And part of this exchange was where one person takes off a sandal and gives it to the other guy. And actually, it's interesting that, again, the commentaries I looked at said it's not entirely clear which one has taken off a sandal and which one is receiving the sandal. It simply says he took off his sandal. We're not quite sure who did that, but it is a curious detail. It's likely Boaz, who's giving the sandal to the other guy because the other kinsman is giving up a right. So one would think in most contracts there's what they call consideration. Each party gives something to the other party. And if you don't do that, then sometimes contract will fail because there's not been consideration. So anyway, curious way of doing business, but that's what they did. That's what they did in those days. Also, something here is interesting. We're talking about the acquisition of property in two kinds. Property one being the land, the parcel of land that belonged to Elimelech, that may have been mortgaged to somebody else or sold off to somebody else, but it's still Elimelech's land. And then there's the acquisition of that parcel, but there's also the acquisition of Ruth. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite. I mean, it's a verb, literally means bought, which again is pretty stunning. I mean, we're not used to thinking of women as property. And yet that's all too often how women were treated. We'll find that that's no reflection of her value. We'll see that reflected here in a few minutes. But it again, it's a reminder that we're looking at a culture that in many ways is way different, very different from our own. And I find it unimaginable that women were ever thought of in those terms. But you'll notice how detailed this is. I mean, this is a very lawyerly document, even if it's not written. Your witnesses I have acquired from the hand of Naomi. And notice how complete this is. All that belonged to Elimelech, and just to make sure we don't miss anything, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. So any property, even if it was deeded or put in other people's names, Boaz is being very complete here, very comprehensive in making sure that he's acquired all the rights to all the property that might be out there. Notice too that all this is in the context of Boaz and Ruth are eventually going to get married. In fact, it's going to happen here pretty quickly. But a wedding here, a private wedding, just wasn't going to happen under these circumstances, right? It just wasn't. And it sort of raises the question: how private are weddings anyway? I mean, are they really private? I mean, we can think of, I suppose, you can run off to, Vegas and elope. Some people, I guess, a fair number of couples do that or used to do that. But weddings are never completely private. In the Episcopal Church, at least, and I think in most jurisdictions, you have to have at least one witness. You have to have somebody to officiate. You have to have at least one other witness. Why? Because weddings are public. Common law marriages, and I don't know if any states even recognize those anymore, but common law marriages were marriages in which there was no official exchange of vows. There was no piece of paper filed at the courthouse, but you had two people who treated each other as married spouses, who presented themselves and lived out their lives in public as husband and wife. And it was that notorious and open idea that they were, meaning they were known. This marriage was known and was not hidden. So what we mean by notorious and open. That over time, that would itself would create a marriage. So the marriages have been defined not just by the private connection between the two people wishing to marry, but also by the public acknowledgement and even to some extent participation in that. And so this is an idea that we still have today in our modern understanding of marriage, and it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And what are the advantages, by the way, if people know that you are part of a married couple? Are there advantages to that or disadvantages to that? Any thoughts? I'm asking as a single guy, so I really don't know. You tell me.
There's certainly legal advantages. This is written like a contract. There's certainly legal advantages and rights that you have as a spouse that you don't have for someone that you have not made that public declaration with.
Yeah. And I would think that there would also be a measure of accountability. If people know that you're married, that they see you differently. I mean, I know that guys, and I'm just speaking as a guy, if a guy is interested in a woman and says, oh, she's married, oh, never mind. Most guys at least will do the, oh, never mind, and back off because they understand. It changes our relationships with each other and can help couples be accountable to each other as well, I think. Anyway, pressing on, moving on to verses 11 and 12. We've got remember we had the nearer kinsman, the one most closely related, has said thanks, but no thanks. Boaz has stepped up, so I'm going to redeem the land and Ruth, the Moabite. And you are the witnesses. Then verse 11, then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. What we see here is a tripartite or a three-part blessing offered by the elders. It is their formal acknowledgement, not just of what's happening involving the parcel of land, but most importantly, the relationship that now exists or that will exist between Boaz and Ruth. And notice the three parts start with, may the woman, so it's going to focus on Ruth, be like Rachel and Leah, who were Jacob's wives. Right? These two women are the mothers of all the 12 tribes and all the people of Israel. All right. So in other words, Ruth coming into Boaz's life means more than just what's going to happen for the two of them and their relationship together, that relationship is going to have, their prayer is, their blessing is, it's going to have lasting effects for generations. So that brings us to the second blessing. May you, first blessing focused on Ruth, may you, Boaz, produce children, right? Bestow a name in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, we're coming back to Bethlehem. That's where we started. And that's where the story will end up because it ends up with David, who is from Bethlehem. So we're making that sort of that full circle. And the third part of the blessing then is a reference to, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Tamar is a lot like Ruth in that she had all sorts of initiative in ways that, you just need to read Genesis chapter 38. It's a quick read, and you read it and you go, really? This is in the Bible? Tamar does some pretty interesting things there, and I'll just leave it there, and hopefully you'll be curious enough to read it for yourself. But Tamar acted in some again, she showed lots of initiative to care for herself, to secure her own future, and which is exactly, of course, what Naomi and Ruth have done. So we've got a three-part blessing. Again, this marriage is not a private affair. It's very public, and it's celebrated. It's being celebrated. It's not tolerated. It's being celebrated. So let's get these two hitched, shall we? Verses 13 to 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. One sentence, right? Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. I mean, marriages are a big deal. Trust me, I've done, I think, over 30 weddings in my ministry. And they all involve lots of planning about getting married, the planning for the ceremony and all those choices. And then conversations about being married. What happens, the next day and in the days and the weeks and the years to follow. So there's a lot packed in here, and we might well ask, and I'll give you a moment if you want to offer any observations. I mean, what do you think is going on in Boaz's, in his head, in his heart? What's Ruth experiencing as she goes through all this, and maybe even to some extent Naomi? What does this mean for them?
I mean, hopefully she's experiencing happiness and love, but at least rescue.
Yeah.
Security.
I'm sorry, what's that, Dudley?
Security. It doesn't say anything about Boaz having another wife. I think that's real interesting. That he's a man of property and nobody's gotten him yet.
Yeah. Especially since we know that he's an older gentleman, at least older than Ruth. So yeah, you wonder about that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So security. I mean, there's a lot happening, a lot packed into that sentence, a lot of meaning. Mm-hmm. I think we're welcome to read into that. Mm-hmm. And notice that God. We've talked about God has been sort of in the background, right? And God has been talked about, but God has not been very active here. But here. We read that when they came together, the Lord made her conceive and she bore a son. So all of a sudden God, why does God show up now? Why is God mentioned now?
Made her conceive.
Made her conceive. In other words, that this miracle of pregnancy and birth isn't something that happens just because 2 people came together. Right, that is enough of a miracle that surely God is present. So I don't know that this is meant to mean. I mean, we tend to read it as in God was somehow actively involved in this. I think this may simply be an acknowledgement that anytime there's a miracle, we understand that God has been involved. I mean, we give thanks for the food on our table when we're sitting down to eat. And certainly we're going to acknowledge God at the birth of a child. Of course, we read this and we at least, I don't know about you, I'm thinking the Lord made her conceive and she bore a son. Is it just me, or doesn't that sound just a bit familiar?
Yes.
I'm thinking it might.
Gabriel.
I mean, maybe this will come back to me in say December, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like Gabriel.
Yeah. It sounds like that. The whole nativity story, right? Here it is. Now, it's not. I mean, but here is something just for us to think about, and I don't know what to make of it except just to put it out there to ponder. But as Christians, we read that sentence and we our mind goes to Mary and Jesus, right? I mean, at least mine does. And but this, of course, is part of the Jewish Bible, and this is what has been and remains part of Jewish scripture. I can't imagine very many Jews read this and think of Jesus. So it's just, for me, it's just a reminder that even though we share many of our sacred texts with our Jewish brothers and sisters, that our perspective on them and our understanding of those can sometimes be rather different, and that, which is fine, but it is somewhat different. Then we remember what we had the men, the elders at the gate offer that three-part blessing, right? Now, after she has borne a son, now women are going to speak up and they're going to offer their own kind of blessing. Blessed, and it starts with blessed be the Lord, because again, there's a birth, there's a miracle, God must be present. Who's not left you this day without next of kin? Remember that long-term solution they were looking for, and to answer that long-term need of survival, past the harvest season. That's now taken care of. Ruth is taken care of. But the women now are speaking to Naomi and acknowledging that she too has been cared for. She is not left without next of kin, right? That he, the son, will be to you a restorer of life, right? A nourisher of your old age. Obed's being born. Obed just isn't coming into the family that is defined as only Boaz and Ruth. Naomi is very much part of that family. And so Naomi's going to be very much blessed in all this. And you think about all of this. Think about Naomi when she comes back. She says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. And I come here, and I've returned empty. No, you're not empty. That she's being reminded your life is restored and you're going to be nourished forever. She speaks alone at the end of chapter 1. I come back empty. Of course, Ruth is by her side, but she feels very alone still. But now in this moment, she's surrounded by the women who assure her that even though, she thought her life was bitterly, God had dealt bitterly with her, she is reminded that, no, blessed be the Lord, because it is the Lord who's made all these things possible. That even though she's been through great difficulty and challenge, God is still faithful and good and provides for those whom he loves. What a beautiful message for Naomi, and frankly it's the kind of thing as we say in my line of work that preaches. That's the kind of thing you could wamp up a pretty good sermon out of all of this in our current context of people suffering and in so many different ways with the current pandemic. That we feel empty, that we wonder, is God dealing bitterly with us? And the story of Ruth, not unlike the story of Job in some ways, is a reminder that period of suffering and challenge is never permanent, that it will be resolved. That's our hope and our prayer. They also say something very interesting here, talking about Ruth. Your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons. We've been talking a lot about how much Naomi could do, or Ruth could do, in terms of demonstrating initiative and taking action for her own sake. But there are certain things that they couldn't do. Naomi couldn't sell the property. Ruth couldn't redeem herself. She had to rely and trust in Boaz, and Boaz to do the right thing. So you might think that women are somehow undervalued, and yet the women here are saying, not so fast. Not so fast. This woman, this Ruth, is worth more to you than 7 sons. Which is a pretty cool and perhaps even radical thing to say. It is a reminder that even when the social, and I'm giving this a contemporary spin, maybe not entirely consistent with the way it might have been seen back in the day, but I can't help. When I read this, I can't help but think that here's an acknowledgement that even when culture, even when the legal system puts boundaries, that you can well exceed those. The sons have value because they can work and they can hold property. But here's a woman who's worth any 7, men because of what she has done, because of her faithfulness, because of her hard work, because of her initiative, because of her care for Naomi, all of that. So anyway, I think that's a fun detail to look at. Again, we talked about Naomi being very much a part of this family. Naomi took the child, laid him in her bosom, became his nurse. It doesn't mean that Naomi became Obed's wet nurse. That would not have been possible, really. But it does mean that this kid is, well, how do we describe the relationship between Naomi and Obed? It's grandmother and grandson, right?
Grandmother.
Yeah. But it's deeper than that. I have grandchildren, and I see them, to be honest, especially during the pandemic, once every maybe couple of weeks. I'm not nearly as close to them as I would like, but I'm just not nearly as attentive. But we get the sense here that Naomi and Obed are going to be together as long as Naomi's alive. I mean, every day. Naomi's going to be a presence in that kid's life every moment. And that's
More like a nanny.
yeah, and like a nanny in some respects, absolutely. So I think that's
Naomi laying him in her bosom meant she laid him next to her heart. She
Good. That's good. I like that.
took
Yeah,
him into
that's
her
excellent, Linda.
heart and loved
Yeah.
Hmm. It reminds me of Moses' mother getting to take care of him. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's kind of interesting. Jochebed.
Well, I mean, and we see that so often in Scripture. We'll see similar situations or images that will repeat. That will come up, surface again and again. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's the way things are. But yeah, it's a good point. So we talked about the women, and they named him Obed. They named him Obed. The women named him Obed. What's wrong with that picture?
Women don't usually name, or outside of the family, don't usually name other people's children.
Yeah, exactly. So there we have it. But they do, and which is an odd. I mean, that was. I mean, certainly that wasn't the custom in those days that the outsiders named their kids. And earlier we've talked about names being so important. It just occurs to me that I don't know what the name Obed means, if it means anything.
My Bible says worshipped.
Mine says servant of the Lord.
Yeah.
There we go.
There you go.
Obadiah. Obed is short for Obadiah, which means servant of the Lord.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Linda. Cool.
That's what my little book says.
Very good. Okay, so Obed becomes the father of Jesse, the father of David. Why are Obed's descendants important to a Jewish audience? Well,
David.
Because King David, who was, was the greatest king Israel had ever known. Saul not having worked out quite as people might have hoped, and David reuniting the northern and southern kingdoms that nobody had, defeating enemies. He did some. Of course, he did have that whole episode with Uriah and Bathsheba, not one of his better moments. But Naomi is rightly celebrated as being the greatest king Israel had ever known. So much so that when people are anticipating the arrival of a Messiah, back in the days of Jesus, and they recognize Jesus is indeed that Messiah, they talk about him as son of David. And they talk about the Messiah as son of David, someone to live into that Davidic promise. Because God says to David, your heirs will be kings forever. And that wasn't a promise. They're not looking for the promise to David so much to be complete, but that's really a promise that was made to the Israelites, that they would have a king, that they would be cared for forever. And so then that all focuses on David. And so it's important to us because David, as we'll find out in the so David is important because he's the first king, and Jesus is sort of the completion of that Davidic kingship. And we'll find out David is in the line of ancestors of Jesus as well. So speaking of line of ancestors, the book ends with 3 short verses. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Abinadab, Abinadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. And here ends the book. And it ends with the sense of we're going to bring it full circle. We're going to bring it full circle back to David. We started in Bethlehem. We bring it back to David, who was of Bethlehem. This genealogy we find echoed in very early in Matthew's gospel in particular, where we see some familiar names show up: Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David, and then continuing on down to Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And it's interesting that in Matthew's genealogy, Ruth is mentioned by name, one of, I think, only 4 women mentioned in that genealogy, because you tend to track genealogies by the men, not so much by the women. But Ruth was important enough that she was worth mentioning, gets her own book in the Old Testament, of course, and shows up again in Matthew's gospel. We're running a couple minutes behind, but there are 3 questions I wanted to leave you with to ponder as we go our way this morning. And the first is this: Ruth could do a lot, but she was unable to redeem herself. And how far can we go in redeeming ourselves? I mean, we like to be self-sufficient and independent, but Ruth couldn't be entirely independent. She had to depend on somebody else. And in terms of our own redemption, maybe there's a lot that we can do for ourselves. Maybe there are times when we have to depend upon others. Now, redemption in her case involved, she was treated as she was acquired, as one would purchase property. Redemption requires paying a price. And Jesus, when we think about Jesus and what he did in Holy Week and on the cross, we talk about that oftentimes in terms of redemption. And we think about Jesus as paying the price for our redemption. That is one way to understand the event and the meaning and the power of the cross. And this story might help us understand a little bit more about that Jewish understanding of redemption that requires us to depend upon somebody else who can do something that maybe we cannot do for ourselves, who can pay a price maybe that we cannot. So worth bearing in mind as we, a few months down the road, move into Holy Week. And then finally this, one of the commentators wrote, Ruth brought life and goodness to everyone she touched. Think about it. She was such a blessing first to Naomi and then to Boaz, and through her, all the people of Israel and to all the world, because she's one of the ancestors of Christ. She never meant to do any of that. She never meant to have such a role. She clung to somebody she cared about, even if it meant leaving her own land and customs and faith. She never meant to be a source of blessing for so many. And I wonder how many of us live lives that are not unlike that, where we just want to be with somebody we care about. We just want to help somebody. But along the way, maybe we offer more blessing than we know, or we might think about. And so just for me, it begs the question, whom do you bless? Maybe in ways you don't know. I don't know the answer to that, and maybe you don't either. But I like to think that you do. I like to think that we all do. So with that, thank you for joining us and being part of this class the last 4 weeks. I sure appreciate your comments. Any final comments, questions, observations?
Thank you for doing this.
Yes, it's been enjoyable.
It has.
Well, good. Well, we'll be back in a few weeks with Amanda and a class for our time in the season of Advent. So thank you all so much. God bless. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.